Chapter 1. The Dragon's Head. August 5th, 1945. Northfield, Tinian Island. The sun had long since bled out below the horizon, leaving the small Pacific island drenched in a thick, tropical darkness. The air, heavy with the scent of salt and aviation fuel, clung to the skin like a damp shroud. Here, carved from coral and jungle, was the largest and busiest airfield in the world. A city of steel birds and determined men, poised at the very tip of America's spear pointed at the heart of the Japanese Empire. Tonight, however, the usual cacophony of roaring engines and clanging metal was subdued, replaced by a focused, almost reverent quiet. Under the harsh artificial glare of mobile floodlights, one aircraft stood apart. It was a Boeing B-29 Super Fortress, serial number 44 EAT 6292. Its silver skin, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the nervous energy of the men swarming around it. But this was no ordinary bomber, and this was no ordinary night. On its nose, painted in bold black letters just the day before, was a name, Enola Gay, a simple sentimental tribute from its commander, Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, Jr., to his mother. A name that would soon be seared into the memory of the world, synonymous with a fire hotter than the sun. Inside the cavernous bomb bay of the Enola Gay, cradled in a specially constructed harness, lay the reason for this hushed intensity. It was 10 feet long, 28 inches in diameter, and weighed nearly 10,000 pounds. Its official designation was L-11. To the men who built it in the secret laboratories of New Mexico, it was known simply as the Gadget. To the crew who would deliver it, it was Little Boy. It was the culmination of 3 years of frantic top-secret effort, the product of 100,000 mines and $2 billion. It was a weapon of unprecedented power, a chained demon of physics that promised to end the most brutal war in human history. Or, perhaps, to unleash a new and more terrible kind of hell on Earth. No one knew for sure. Colonel Tibbets, a man of 30, with a calm demeanor that belied the immense pressure on his shoulders, moved through the organized chaos of the pre-flight preparations. He was a superb pilot, handpicked by generals for his skill and his unnerving composure. He had flown missions over Nazi-occupied Europe, and had been involved with the B-29 program from its infancy. He understood the machine better than anyone, but the machine's cargo was another matter entirely. He had been briefed, of course. He knew it was an atomic device. He had been told its explosive yield was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. But these were just numbers, abstract concepts that failed to capture the terrifying reality of what was locked in his bomb bay. He had been given his orders directly from the highest levels of command. His target was a city of over 300,000 souls. His mission was to fly 6 hours north, find a specific bridge in the center of that city, and release the weapon. He was not to be deterred by weather or enemy fire. The success of the mission, he was told, was of paramount importance. As he conferred with his navigator, Captain Theodore Dutch Van Kirk, and his bombardier, Major Thomas Fearby, the weight of that phrase settled upon them. They were professionals, the best in the Army Air Forces. But this was different. Every bombing run was a dance with death. But this one felt final. It was a step into a new, dark territory. Elsewhere on the island, Captain William Deke Parsons, the mission's weaponeer, was making his own final checks. A Navy ordnance expert from the Los Alamos laboratory, Parsons was a man haunted by a specific fear. He worried that if the B-29 crashed on takeoff, the fully armed bomb could detonate, wiping Tinian Island and its tens of thousands of personnel off the map. It was a risk he deemed unacceptable. He had made a last-minute decision, one that would require him to perform a delicate and dangerous task in the cramped, unpressurized confines of the Enola Gay's bomb bay after takeoff. He would arm the bomb in mid-air. He would be the last man to touch the device, to complete the circuits that would awaken the dragon. He practiced the procedure in his mind, over and over, his hands mimicking the intricate steps. One slip, one wrong connection, and the mission would end before it had even truly begun. A small group of chaplains moved among the ground crews and flight crews, offering quiet prayers and words of encouragement. The Protestant chaplain, William Downey, had prepared a special prayer for the men of the 509th Composite Group, the unit created specifically for this atomic mission. He would deliver it over the island's public address system just before takeoff. "We pray thee that the end of the war may come soon." The prayer would read, "and that once more we may know peace on earth." It was a prayer for peace, to be delivered alongside a weapon of unimaginable violence. The paradox was lost on no one. For the 12 men who would form the crew of the Enola Gay, the final hours were a blur of briefings, equipment checks, and attempts at a few hours of restless sleep. They ate a final meal of pineapple fritters and coffee. They were young men, mostly in their 20s, from towns and cities across America. They were products of the Great Depression and a world at war. They had seen their friends die over Europe and in the flak-filled skies above Japan. They were tired of the war. They wanted to go home, and they had been told this mission would make that happen. They understood their duty, but the true nature of their cargo was known to only a select few among them. The others knew it was a powerful new bomb, a super explosive, but they could not comprehend the scale. How could they? No one could, not even the scientists who had conceived it. As the final hour approached, a sense of destiny, heavy and inexorable, settled over Northfield. The floodlights cast long, dancing shadows. The propellers of the Enola Gay, 3 massive blades each, stood motionless, waiting for the spark of life. This was the culmination of a global conflict that had consumed 60 million lives. It was the end point of a scientific journey that began in the quiet laboratories of European physicists and ended here, on a remote coral runway in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The men of the Enola Gay were about to climb aboard their silver ship and fly north, into history. They were carrying a message from one world to another, a message of fire and force, written in the language of subatomic particles. The city of Hiroshima slept, unaware that it had been chosen as the recipient. It was a city waking to another ordinary wartime day, a day of rationing, of quiet anxieties, but a day that was, for now, still whole, that was about to change. Everything was about to change. The order was given. The engines of the Enola Gay coughed to life, one by one, sputtering blue flames into the humid night before settling into a deafening, ground-shaking roar. The dragon was stirring, and the world held its breath, completely unaware that it was on the precipice of a new and terrible age. Chapter 2. The Cauldron of War. To understand the fire that would fall on Hiroshima, one must first understand the inferno from which it was born. By the summer of 1945, the Second World War had raged for 6 long years, a global conflagration that had redrawn maps, shattered empires, and introduced new dimensions of industrial-scale slaughter. In Europe, the war was over. The Nazi regime had been crushed into rubble and surrender. But in the Pacific, the conflict with the Empire of Japan had entered its most savage and desperate phase. The war against Japan was a different kind of war. It was not a war of sweeping tank battles across open plains, but grueling island-by-island struggle across a vast ocean. It was a war fought in dense malarial jungles, on volcanic beaches of black sand, and in the claustrophobic confines of caves and tunnels. It was a war characterized by a fanaticism that American soldiers found both terrifying and incomprehensible. The Japanese fighting code of Bushido, a warrior ethos that valued death over surrender, meant that battles were not won until nearly every enemy soldier was killed. This was not hyperbole, it was a statistical reality. On islands like Saipan, Tarawa, and Pelio, Japanese garrisons fought to the last man, often ending battles in suicidal banzai charges against American machine guns. Prisoners were a rarity. The fighting was brutal, personal, and dehumanizing for both sides. The Pacific War became a war of racial animosity, where propaganda on both sides depicted the enemy as subhuman beasts, making acts of extreme violence easier to commit and to justify. By 1945, American forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands. The strategy, known as island hopping, was a bloody success. But as the Americans drew closer to Japan, the fighting grew exponentially more ferocious. The battle for Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island just 8 square miles in size, cost the United States Marine Corps nearly 7,000 dead and 20,000 wounded. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, all but 200 were killed. It was a preview of what an invasion of Japan itself would look like. Then came Okinawa, the final stepping stone to Japan. Okinawa was considered sovereign Japanese territory. The battle, which began on April 1, 1945, was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War and its bloodiest battle. For 82 days, American soldiers and Marines fought their way across the island against a deeply entrenched and fanatically determined enemy. The Japanese military unleashed a new and terrifying weapon, the kamikaze. Pilots in planes packed with explosives would deliberately crash themselves into American ships, turning themselves into human-guided missiles. These divine wind attacks sank dozens of ships and killed nearly 5,000 American sailors. On the island itself, the fighting was a nightmare of mud, artillery, and close-quarters combat. The Japanese soldiers fought from a complex network of caves and pillboxes, emerging to attack and then melting back into the earth. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. The Americans suffered over 50,000 casualties, including 12,000 killed. But the most horrifying statistic from Okinawa was the toll on civilians. Caught between 2 warring armies, an estimated 150,000 Okinawan civilians perished, a third of the island's population. Many were killed in the crossfire, while others were forced into combat by the Japanese army, or took their own lives, having been told by propaganda that the Americans were monsters who would rape and torture them. Okinawa was a horrifying dress rehearsal for the invasion of Japan. It convinced American military planners that invading the home islands would precipitate a bloodbath on a scale that would dwarf the D-Day landings in Normandy. The Japanese government was mobilizing the entire population for a final decisive battle or Kessen. Millions of civilians, including women and children, were being trained to fight with bamboo spears, ancient muskets, and makeshift explosives. The military's slogan was 100 million will die for the Emperor. American planners, preparing for the invasion codenamed Operation Downfall, projected staggering casualty figures. Estimates varied, but some projections reached as high as 1 million American casualties and several million Japanese casualties. President Harry S. Truman, who had taken office in April 1945 after the sudden death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, was now faced with this grim arithmetic. He was a plain-spoken man from Missouri, thrust into the presidency with little knowledge of the war's deepest secrets. One of those secrets was a project so clandestine it was known only by a codename, the Manhattan Project. The project was born from a letter. In 1939, a group of émigré scientists, including the brilliant Leo Szilard, persuaded Albert Einstein to sign a letter to President Roosevelt. The letter warned that recent discoveries in nuclear physics, particularly the work of German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann on nuclear fission, made it conceivable that an extremely powerful bomb of a new type could be constructed. They feared that Nazi Germany was already working on such a weapon. Roosevelt, convinced of the danger, authorized the creation of a small research program. For 2 years the project moved slowly, but after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor plunged America into the war, the effort was given top priority and immense resources. It was placed under the command of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, led by the brusque, can-do General Leslie R. Groves. The scientific direction was entrusted to a charismatic, complex, and brilliant theoretical physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer. In the remote desert landscape of Los Alamos, New Mexico, a secret city was built from scratch. It became home to a collection of the world's most brilliant scientific minds, Nobel laureates, promising young physicists, and expert engineers, all working in complete secrecy. Their singular goal was to turn the abstract theories of nuclear physics into a functional weapon before the Germans could. They were racing against a ghost. It would only be after the war that they learned the German atomic program had been small and ineffective. The scientific and engineering challenges were immense. They had to produce enough fissile material, either enriched uranium or plutonium, which was a monumental industrial undertaking in itself. Huge city-sized factories were built at Oak Ridge, Tennessee and Hanford, Washington for this purpose alone. At Los Alamos, the scientists had to design a device that could reliably trigger a runaway nuclear chain reaction. 2 designs emerged. One, a relatively simple gun-type device, would fire one piece of uranium-235 into another to achieve critical mass. This design was so straightforward that the scientists were confident it would work without a full-scale test. It would become Little Boy. The second design was far more complex. It involved a sphere of plutonium that had to be crushed, or imploded, with perfect symmetry by a surrounding layer of conventional explosives. This implosion method was so intricate and uncertain that a full-scale test was deemed essential. This device would be nicknamed Fat Man. While the scientists in the desert worked feverishly, the war in the Pacific ground on. In an effort to break Japan's will to fight, the United States had already unleashed another form of devastating aerial warfare, firebombing. Led by the aggressive General Curtis LeMay, fleets of B-29C began flying low-level incendiary raids over Japan's densely populated wooden-built cities. The results were apocalyptic. On the night of March 9, 1945, over 300 B-29C dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The attack created a firestorm, a self-sustaining vortex of flame that consumed 16 square miles of the city. The heat was so intense it boiled the water in canals. An estimated 100,000 people were killed in a single night, more than would initially die at Hiroshima. Over the next 5 months, American firebombing raids would devastate more than 60 Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians and leaving millions homeless. Yet, Japan fought on. The government was controlled by a military faction that refused to countenance the idea of surrender, which they viewed as the ultimate dishonor. Even as their cities burned and their navy lay at the bottom of the ocean, they prepared for the final battle on their home soil. They put their faith in the indomitable spirit of the Japanese people and the divine protection of their emperor. It was against this backdrop of escalating brutality and intransigence that the atomic bomb was nearing completion. The scientists at Los Alamos had started their work with the fear of a Nazi bomb as their primary motivation. But now, Germany was defeated. The weapon they had built to deter one enemy was now being considered for use against another. For President Truman and his advisors, the bomb seemed to offer a way out of the bloody calculus of invasion. It was a potential miracle weapon that could shock Japan into surrender and save hundreds of thousands of American lives. The momentum of the $2 billion project was immense, and the logic of war was relentless. In this cauldron of fire, fanaticism, and fear, the stage was set for a decision that would alter the course of human history. The question was no longer if the bomb could be built, but if it should be used, and in the desperate summer of 1945, there were few in power who saw any other choice. Chapter 3. The First Light, July 16, 1945. Jornada del Muerto Desert, New Mexico. The name given by Spanish conquistadors centuries earlier meant Journey of the Dead Man. It was a desolate, unforgiving expanse of scrub and sand, a place of extreme temperatures and profound emptiness. It was here, in this god-forsaken corner of the American Southwest, that humanity was preparing to ignite its own star on Earth. This was the Trinity Site. For weeks, a frantic, nerve-wracking effort had been underway. A 100-foot steel tower had been erected in the center of the desert floor. Atop this tower, technicians and scientists made final adjustments to a spherical device 5 feet in diameter, bristling with wires and detonators. This was the gadget, the test device, a plutonium implosion bomb identical to the one that would later be designated Fat Man. The atmosphere at the test site was a cocktail of exhaustion, anxiety, and giddy anticipation. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of Los Alamos, seemed to be everywhere at once. He was a wraith of a man, gaunt and chain-smoking, his brilliant blue eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to consume him from within. The weight of the entire Manhattan Project rested on his slender shoulders. If the test failed, if it was a fizzle, it would be a catastrophic setback. The plutonium implosion method was the only way to make a bomb from the more readily produced plutonium. Failure would mean they had only one bomb, the untested uranium gun-type design, and the entire strategy for ending the war could collapse. Worse, a failed test could scatter deadly plutonium across the desert, creating an environmental disaster and revealing the secret project to the world. The pressure was immense. General Leslie Groves, the military head of the project, was equally tense, though he concealed it better beneath his brusque, authoritarian exterior. For Groves, Trinity was the ultimate test of his $2 billion gamble. He was a man who dealt in concrete results, and he needed this test to work. He had already established a betting pool among the scientists on the bomb's yield. The estimates ranged from a dud to Oppenheimer's own nervous guess of 300 tons of TNT, all the way to the physicist to Rabi's bet that it would be 18,000 tons. No one truly knew what to expect. Some harbored darker, more apocalyptic fears. In the months leading up to the test, there had been a lingering, though remote, theoretical possibility that the atomic detonation could ignite the nitrogen in the Earth's atmosphere, setting the entire planet on fire. The physicist Hans Bethe had run the calculations and concluded the odds were virtually zero. But the thought, once planted, was hard to completely uproot. As Enrico Fermi, the Nobel laureate who had created the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, took bets on whether the bomb would ignite the atmosphere, a sliver of primal fear remained. The test was scheduled for 4 a.m., but as the hour approached, the weather turned against them. A thunderstorm rolled in, with flashes of lightning and gusts of wind. A detonation in such conditions was too risky. Radioactive fallout could be carried unpredictably by the storm. The test was postponed. At the control bunker, 10,000 yards south of the tower, the mood grew heavy. Oppenheimer paced nervously. His brother Frank watched him, later remarking, "I think he was just trying to stay sane." The men waited, checking their instruments, drinking coffee, and staring out at the rain-lashed darkness. Finally, the project's chief meteorologist, Jack Hubbard, gave a tentative forecast for a break in the weather between 5:30 and 6 a.m. The countdown was reset for 5:30 a.m. In the final minutes, the scientists and observers positioned in bunkers and trenches at various distances from ground zero prepared themselves. They were given welder's glass to protect their eyes. A message was broadcast over the radio network: 0-10 minutes. A robotic sequence controller took over the final stages of the countdown. Oppenheimer, Groves, and other key personnel were in the South 10,000 control bunker. Oppenheimer, clinging to a post for support, was barely breathing. General Groves later wrote of him, "Oppenheimer grew tenser as the last seconds ticked off. He scarcely breathed. He held on to a post to steady himself. At -45 seconds, the final switch was thrown. The automated sequence was now irreversible. A voice over the loudspeaker called out the final seconds. 10, 9, 8. In that final drawn-out moment, the entire history of human conflict, the long journey of scientific discovery from Aristotle to Newton to Einstein, converged on this single point in the New Mexico desert. At precisely 5 hours 29 minutes and 45 seconds a.m., Mountain War Time, the world changed forever. There was a flash. It was not a flash of light. It was light itself. A searing, silent, impossible brilliance that was not of this world. It was as if someone had opened a furnace door on the sun. The light filled the sky, illuminated the desert floor, and etched the distant mountains in sharp, surreal detail. It was brighter than 1,000 suns, a light that was felt as much as seen. Men miles away, with their backs to the blast, saw the bones in their hands through their closed eyelids. The physicist Otto Frisch described it as a vision from the Book of Revelation. For a moment, there was only the silent, blinding light. Then came the heat, a wave of warmth like opening an oven, even from 10 miles away. And then, nearly a minute later, came the sound. It was not a single bang, but a deep, prolonged, terrifying roar that echoed and re-echoed off the mountains. A sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was the sound of the world's first nuclear explosion. As the sound wave hit the control bunker, a collective gasp went through the room. The test had not been a fizzle. It had been a spectacular, terrifying success. A vast, churning ball of fire, a kaleidoscope of orange, purple, and yellow rose from the desert floor. It climbed higher and higher, coiling and twisting, before shaping itself into the now iconic mushroom cloud, reaching 40,000 feet into the dawn sky. The steel tower at ground zero had vanished, vaporized by a temperature 4 times hotter than the center of the sun. The desert sand in a half-mile radius had been fused into a greenish, radioactive glass, later named trinitite. The relief in the control bunker was palpable, electric. Men cheered, shook hands, and clapped each other on the back. General Groves, his anxieties finally lifted, turned to his deputy and said, "The war is over." Oppenheimer's reaction was more complex. The relief was there, but it was mingled with a profound and chilling sense of awe and dread. Years later, he would recall what went through his mind in that moment. It was a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. As the mushroom cloud ascended into the heavens, he thought, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The sentiment was shared by others. The test director, Kenneth Bainbridge, turned to Oppenheimer amidst the celebration and said quietly, "Now we are all sons of bitches." The news of the successful test was immediately relayed in a coded message to President Truman, who was in Potsdam, Germany, meeting with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin to discuss the post-war order. The message read, "Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations." Truman was elated. This new power strengthened his hand in negotiations, particularly with Stalin. He now possessed what he called an entirely new weapon of unusual destructive force. The moral and strategic implications were immense, but in the context of ending a brutal war, they seemed, for the moment, secondary. The journey that began with a theoretical letter had ended with a man-made star in the desert. The power of the atom had been unlocked. The scientists had done their job. They had built the bomb. The dragon was now fully awake, and its masters were the politicians and the generals. The question of what to do with this terrible new power was no longer a scientific one. It was a question that would now be answered in the corridors of power in Washington and Potsdam, and its answer would be delivered from the bomb bay of a B-29, aimed at a city that was for a few more weeks still at peace. The first light had dawned, but it cast a long and ominous shadow over the future of the world. Chapter 4. The Deciders and the Doomed. In the summer of 1945, the fate of hundreds of thousands of people rested in the hands of a few men, separated by ideology, culture, and a vast ocean. They were the deciders, the leaders who held the levers of power, and their choices would shape the final violent chapter of the Second World War. On one side was Harry S. Truman, a former farmer and haberdasher from Missouri. Truman was a product of machine politics, not the Ivy League. He was blunt, decisive, and unpretentious. When Franklin D. Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, Truman was thrust into the presidency with shocking speed. He had been vice president for only 82 days and had been kept largely in the dark about the war's most critical secrets. He famously remarked to reporters, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." He knew nothing of the Manhattan Project. It was only after he was sworn in that Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson took him aside and told him about a new explosive of almost unbelievable power. Truman was now the commander-in-chief of a nation that had been at war for 3.5 years. The American public was weary of the conflict, horrified by the mounting casualty lists from the Pacific. Truman's paramount goal, his overriding responsibility as he saw it, was to end the war as quickly as possible, and with the minimum loss of American lives. He was not a man given to deep philosophical introspection. He saw the atomic bomb as a military weapon, albeit a uniquely powerful one. If it could shorten the war and prevent the bloody invasion of Japan, then his duty was to use it. He leaned heavily on the advice of his senior advisors: Stimson, a respected elder statesman; James F. Burns, his shrewd and politically ambitious Secretary of State; and General George C. Avor Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, a man of immense integrity and strategic acumen. These men formed the Interim Committee, a group tasked with advising the president on the use of the new weapon. They debated whether to give the Japanese a demonstration of the bomb on an uninhabited island, but the idea was rejected. What if the bomb was a dud? The humiliation would be immense and could strengthen Japan's resolve. What if the Japanese moved American prisoners of war to the demonstration site? And would a single demonstration be enough to convince the fanatical military leadership to surrender? The committee concluded that the only way to make a profound psychological impression was to use the bomb on a military target within a city. Across the world, in the secret city of Los Alamos, the scientific architect of the bomb, Robert Oppenheimer, wrestled with the moral implications of his creation. Oppenheimer was a man of profound contradictions, a brilliant theoretical physicist who loved poetry and mysticism, a charismatic leader who was also insecure and emotionally fragile. He had driven himself and his team relentlessly to build the bomb, motivated by the fear of a Nazi weapon, but with Germany defeated, he and many of his fellow scientists began to have second thoughts. A group of scientists at the project's Chicago laboratory, led by James Frank and Leo Szilard, drafted a petition arguing against the surprise military use of the bomb on a city. They urged a demonstration first. The military advantages and the saving of American lives achieved by the sudden use of atomic bombs against Japan may be outweighed by the ensuing loss of confidence and by a wave of horror and repulsion sweeping over the rest of the world, they wrote. Oppenheimer, however, did not use his considerable influence to support these petitions. When consulted by the Interim Committee, he and a panel of other top scientists, including Enrico Fermi, concluded that they could propose no technical demonstration likely to bring an end to the war. We see no acceptable alternative to direct military use. For Oppenheimer, the job of the scientist was to create the weapon. The decision to use it belonged to the elected leaders. It was a position he would seem to grapple with for the rest of his life. In Tokyo, the power structure was complex and deeply fractured. The ultimate authority was Emperor Hirohito, revered by his people as a living god, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. His word was absolute. In practice, however, he reigned more than he ruled. He was traditionally expected to sanction the decisions made by his government, not to formulate policy himself. For years the government had been dominated by a powerful military clique, a group of hardline generals and admirals who were the driving force behind Japan's expansionist war. Men like General Kurichika Anami, the Minister of War, were steeped in the samurai code of Bushido. To them, surrender was unthinkable, a national stain that could never be erased. They believed that by inflicting massive casualties on an American invasion force, they could negotiate a settlement that would preserve the old imperial system, avoid a foreign occupation, and allow the military to retain its power and honor. They were preparing the entire nation for a suicidal last stand. However, a so-called peace faction was emerging within the Japanese government, centered around civilian leaders like Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki and Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo. They understood that the war was lost. Japan's cities were being incinerated, its navy was sunk, and its people were facing starvation. They were secretly trying to find a way to end the war, seeking mediation from the then-neutral Soviet Union. But they had to move with extreme caution. Any open talk of surrender could lead to their assassination by young, fanatical army officers. Their main stumbling block was the Allied demand for unconditional surrender. This phrase was a source of deep anxiety for all Japanese leaders, peace faction and military alike. They feared it meant the end of the imperial institution and the potential trial of their emperor as a war criminal. The preservation of the emperor was their non-negotiable condition for peace. And so, while the peace faction worked in the shadows, the military's preparations for the final battle continued unabated. The fate of Japan was caught in this political paralysis, a deadlock between those who knew the war was lost and those who refused to admit it. Thousands of miles away from these halls of power, on the island of Tinian, were the men tasked with carrying out the decision. Colonel Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay, was the epitome of a professional soldier. He was focused, disciplined, and utterly dedicated to the mission. He had been involved in the atomic program for over a year, working with the scientists and engineers to modify the B-29 Sir for their unique payload. He insulated his crew from the rumors and anxieties, demanding perfection and focus. He believed the bomb would end the war and save lives. "I was not emotional. I was not moved," he would later say of his mindset. "I had a job to do." His crew were a reflection of America's wartime generation: the calm navigator, Duchess Van Kirk; the expert bombardier, Tom Fearby; the quiet radio operator, Richard Nelson. They were all veterans of the air war, young men who had grown accustomed to the daily business of death from 30,000 feet. They trusted their commander and the mission. And then there were the doomed. In the city of Hiroshima, life went on with a semblance of wartime normality. Hiroshima was a city of significant military and industrial importance. It was the headquarters of the Second General Army, responsible for the defense of all of southern Japan. It was a major port and a hub for military supply and transportation. Yet it had been largely spared the devastating firebombing raids that had leveled other Japanese cities. This was not an accident. Hiroshima, along with a few other cities like Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki, had been deliberately preserved from conventional bombing. They were on a target list, pristine canvases upon which the full, horrifying power of the new weapon could be clearly demonstrated and measured. The people of Hiroshima knew nothing of this. They were simply grateful for their good fortune. People like Setsuko Thurlow, a 13-year-old schoolgirl who had been mobilized, like many of her classmates, to help clear fire breaks in the city, or Akiko Takakura, a 20-year-old bank clerk who was preparing to go to work, or Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, who ran the communications hospital and was preparing for his daily rounds. They worried about food shortages, about loved ones at the front. They were accustomed to the wail of air raid sirens, which had become a regular feature of life. But the American bombers rarely came. On the morning of August 6th, the city was waking up to a clear, beautiful summer day. The sky was a brilliant blue. Children were on their way to school. People were commuting to work, crossing the city's many bridges over the 7 estuaries of the Ota River. They were the people of Hiroshima, living their lives, unaware that they were the designated target in a global equation of power, strategy, and science. They were the human element, the final, tragic variable in a decision made by men they would never know, in rooms they would never see. The deciders had made their choice. The doers were preparing their machine, and the doomed were about to walk into the dawn of the atomic age. Chapter 5. The Point of No Return. In late July 1945, the leaders of the 3 great Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, gathered in the war-ravaged German city of Potsdam. The conference was meant to chart the course for a post-war world, but it was overshadowed by the ongoing bloody conflict in the Pacific. It was here, amidst the ruins of the Third Reich, that the final diplomatic and military steps toward the use of the atomic bomb were taken. President Truman arrived at Potsdam, a new and untested leader on the world stage. He was meeting the formidable Joseph Stalin and the eloquent Winston Churchill for the first time. Initially, Truman felt at a disadvantage, but on July 16th, while at the conference, he received the coded message from Secretary of War Stimson confirming the staggering success of the Trinity test. The news transformed Truman. Churchill, observing the change, noted in his memoirs that the American president became more assertive, more confident. He told the Russians just where they got on and off, and generally bossed the whole meeting. Truman now held what he called his ace in the hole. He believed this new power could not only force Japan's surrender, but also check the post-war ambitions of the Soviet Union. On July 24th, Truman approached Stalin for a seemingly casual conversation. He mentioned, without going into detail, that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, to Truman's surprise, showed little interest, replying simply that he was glad to hear it and hoped the Americans would make good use of it against the Japanese. Truman and Churchill concluded that Stalin hadn't understood the significance of the remark. They were wrong. Through his espionage networks, which had penetrated the Manhattan Project, Stalin was well aware of the American atomic program. His feigned indifference was a masterful piece of political theater. He did not want to give the Americans the satisfaction of knowing how much he knew, or how far behind the Soviet Union was in the atomic race. The primary outcome of the Potsdam Conference regarding Japan was the Potsdam Declaration. Issued on July 26th, it was an ultimatum, a final warning. Signed by the United States, Great Britain, and China, it called for the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces. It promised that Japan would not be enslaved as a race or destroyed as a nation, and it allowed for the continuation of peaceful industries. But it was uncompromising on the core demand: surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. Critically, the declaration made no mention of the fate of Emperor Hirohito. For the Japanese, This was the most important issue. The American policymakers were divided on the matter. Some, like former ambassador to Japan Joseph Grew, argued that allowing the Japanese to keep their emperor was the only way to secure a surrender without a bloody invasion. Others, however, felt that the emperor was a symbol of Japanese militarism and should be removed, possibly even tried as a war criminal. In the end, the hardliners won out, and the guarantee was omitted from the declaration. The declaration also made no mention of the atomic bomb. There was no explicit warning of the new and terrible weapon awaiting Japan. Truman and his advisors had decided against it, fearing it would be seen as a bluff or that it would give the Japanese time to move American prisoners of war into the target cities. The ultimatum was broadcast to Japan and dropped in leaflets over its cities. In Tokyo, the declaration was received with contempt by the military leadership. They saw it as a sign of weakening American resolve, a propaganda piece that simply reiterated old demands. Prime Minister Suzuki, under pressure from the military, held a press conference on July 28. He used the word mokusatsu. It is a word with a subtle and, in this case, tragic ambiguity. It can mean to ignore or to treat with silent contempt, but it can also mean to withhold comment, pending a decision. The Japanese government intended the latter. They were still waiting to hear from the Soviet Union about potential mediation, but the international news agencies translated mokusatsu as reject. To the Allies, it sounded like a defiant and final refusal. For Truman, this was the last straw. The Japanese had been given their chance. They had rejected the final warning. The military gears, which had been grinding forward for weeks, were now fully engaged. The day before the Potsdam Declaration was issued, on July 25, the acting Army Chief of Staff, General Thomas T. Handy, had sent a top-secret order to General Carl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. Army Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific. The order was direct and chillingly bureaucratic. It authorized the 509th Composite Group to deliver its first special bomb as soon as weather would permit visual bombing, after about August 3rd. The primary target was listed as Hiroshima. The secondary targets were Kokura and Nagasaki. The order stated that additional bombs would be delivered on other targets as soon as they were made ready. There was no requirement for a final last-minute authorization from the president. The decision had been made. The order was issued. The machine was now on autopilot. Back on Tinian Island, the men and machines of the 509th Composite Group were in the final stages of preparation. The components of the little boy's bomb had arrived aboard the cruiser USS Indianapolis, which had made a high-speed, unescorted run across the Pacific. Tragically, just days after delivering its top-secret cargo, the Indianapolis was sunk by a Japanese submarine, resulting in one of the worst naval disasters in U.S. history. The enriched uranium projectile and target pieces were the last components to arrive. On Tinian, scientists and ordnance experts worked carefully to assemble the weapon. It was a complex, multi-stage process. They inserted the explosive powder charges, installed the detonators, and finally, loaded the uranium components. By the evening of July 31st, Little Boy was fully assembled and ready. Colonel Tibbets had already selected his primary crew for the mission. He had also chosen his aircraft, B-29 No. 82, which he named Enola Gay. In the days leading up to the mission, the 509th flew a series of practice runs, dropping large orange-painted dummy bombs, nicknamed pumpkins, on Japanese cities. These missions served to accustom the crews to the flight path and bombing procedures, and also to accustom the Japanese to the sight of small flights of high-altitude B-29, lulling them into a false sense of security. The final mission briefing was held on the afternoon of August 5th. Tibbets laid out the plan in precise detail. 3 B-29 SES would fly ahead to scout the weather over the primary, secondary, and tertiary targets. The Enola Gay would be the strike plane, accompanied by 2 other B-29 SES carrying scientific instruments and cameras, the Great Artiste and Necessary Evil. The flight would take approximately 6 hours. They would fly at 5,000 feet to conserve fuel, then climb to over 30,000 feet for the final bomb run. Tibbets emphasized the most critical part of the mission, the escape maneuver. After releasing the bomb, he would have to execute a steep 155-degree diving turn to get the aircraft as far away from the detonation point as possible. The scientists had calculated that the shockwave could destroy the plane if it was too close. They had approximately 43 seconds from the moment of release to the moment of detonation. Every second would count. As the briefing concluded, the weaponeer Deke Parsons walked up to Tibbets. He explained his plan to arm the bomb in flight, to avoid the risk of an accidental detonation on takeoff. Tibbets, recognizing the logic, agreed immediately. It added another layer of complexity and danger to the mission, but it was a necessary precaution. The point of no return had been reached. The diplomatic channels had failed. The ultimatum had been rejected. The scientific work was complete. The military orders had been given. All the complex threads of history, politics, and science that had been weaving together for years were now converging on this single mission, this single aircraft, this single bomb. As the sun set on Tinian on August 5th, there was nothing left but the execution. The crew of the Enola Gay put on their flight suits, collected their gear, and walked out into the humid night air, toward the silver plain waiting for them under the glare of the floodlights. They were about to embark on a journey from which the world could never turn back. Chapter 6. 0 Hour. The engines of the Enola Gay roared to life at 2:45 a.m. on Monday, August 6, 1945. The sound tore through the quiet of Tinian, a declaration of intent that sent a tremor of anticipation through the hundreds of ground crew, photographers, and officials who had gathered to witness the departure. Colonel Paul Tibbets sat in the pilot's seat, his hands moving with practiced ease over the controls. To his right, co-pilot Captain Robert Lewis was running through the final checklist. The plane was dangerously overloaded, heavy with 7,000 gallons of fuel and the 10,000-pound bomb. The runway on Tinian was long, but Tibbets knew he would need every foot of it. He taxied the massive bomber into position. The air inside the cockpit was thick with tension. Tibbets spoke into the intercom, his voice calm and steady. "Okay, let's go." He pushed the 4 throttles forward. The Wright R-3350 engines screamed in protest, their propellers biting into the tropical air. The Enola Gay began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed, lumbering down the coral runway like a prehistoric beast. Lewis, watching the airspeed indicator, called out the numbers. The plane felt sluggish, heavy. It seemed to refuse the sky. For a terrifying moment, it felt as if they would run out of runway and plunge into the Pacific. But then at the very last moment, Tibbets eased back on the yoke, and the silver giant lifted into the darkness. It was 2:45 a.m. They were airborne. As the Enola Gay climbed into the night sky, a dangerous and delicate operation began in the bomb bay. Captain Deke Parsons, the weaponeer, and his assistant, Lieutenant Morris Jepson, made their way into the cramped, unlit space. Working by flashlight, Parsons began the intricate process of arming Little Boy. It took him 15 minutes. He carefully inserted the explosive powder bags, connected the electrical plugs, and switched the device from safe to armed. He was now the only thing standing between a stable piece of machinery and a weapon of mass destruction. One mistake, and the Enola Gay and its crew would be vaporized. He worked with calm precision. When he was finished, he straightened up and gave Jepson a thumbs up. The Dragon was now live. For the next 6 hours, they flew north through the darkness, a tiny, isolated world of metal, and men suspended between the stars above and the black ocean below. The crew settled into the routine of a long flight. Navigator Dutch Van Kirk plotted their course. Bombardier Tom Firaby checked and rechecked his equipment. They were a small silver speck, utterly alone, carrying the fate of a city within their belly. As they flew, the first hints of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon. Below them, the city of Hiroshima was beginning to stir. It was a clear, warm summer morning. The forecast was for fine weather. In the Hachiya household, Dr. Michihiko Hachiya rose from his bed. He was tired. He had been on duty at the hospital the night before. He looked out his window at the beautiful day and felt a sense of peace. In another part of the city, 13-year-old Setsuko Thurlow was getting ready. She and her classmates were not going to school for lessons that day. They had been assigned to a military communications headquarters to learn how to decode messages. At the Sumitomo Bank in the center of the city, 20-year-old Akiko Takakura was preparing for her workday. She and her friend were responsible for sorting out financial documents. They chatted as they worked, their conversation punctuated by the rhythmic click of their abacuses. At 7:09 a.m., a single American weather plane, the B-29 Straight Flush, flew over Hiroshima. The city's air raid sirens wailed. It was a familiar sound. People looked up, saw the lone plane high in the sky, and went back to what they were doing. This was a common occurrence. The single planes were assumed to be on reconnaissance missions. The all-clear siren sounded at 7:31 a.m. A collective sense of relief settled over the city. The danger, it seemed, had passed. The citizens of Hiroshima resumed their morning routines. Office workers began to arrive at their desks. Mothers prepared breakfast. Children set off for school, their laughter echoing in the streets. The city was alive, bustling, completely unaware. Aboard the Enola Gay, now cruising at 31,000 feet, the message came in from the weather scout. Cloud cover less than 3/10 at all altitudes. Advice, bomb primary. Tibbets announced the news over the intercom. It's Hiroshima. He had expected this. Hiroshima had always been the most likely target due to its geography and military significance. The crew began their final preparations. They donned their heavy flak suits and put on dark welder's goggles to protect their eyes from the flash. Lieutenant Jepson went back into the bomb bay one last time. He removed 3 green safety plugs from the bomb and replaced them with red arming plugs. The final physical link was complete. The bomb was now fully armed, ready to be triggered by the barometric sensors that would detonate it at the predetermined altitude of 1,900 feet. At 8:12 a.m. local time, the Enola Gay reached the initial point of its bombing run. Bombardier Tom Farabee took control of the aircraft. He lay on his stomach, peering through the Norden bomb sight, the most advanced targeting device of its time. His target was not a military base or a factory, but a landmark, the distinctive T-shaped AUA bridge, one of the most easily recognizable points in the city center. It was the designated aiming point. Below him, the city of Hiroshima spread out in the morning sun, a mosaic of houses, temples, and canals. Farabee could see it clearly. He made his final adjustments. In a cockpit, Tibbets watched the instruments. The radio operator began transmitting a steady tone to the accompanying B-29 sets, a signal that the bomb run had begun. Aboard the Great Artiste, physicist Luis Alvarez and his team prepared their instruments to measure the blast. Aboard Necessary Evil, a photographer readied his high-speed camera. 43 seconds. That was the window. 43 seconds from release to detonation. Farabee's voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. "I have it." The bomb bay doors snapped open, exposing Little Boy to the cold, thin air. There was a tone, a signal that they were seconds from the release point. The city of Hiroshima continued its mourning, oblivious. A group of schoolgirls was singing in a courtyard. A streetcar rumbled across the Ioi Bridge. A man sat on a stone step, reading his newspaper. At 8:15 and 17 seconds a.m., Hiroshima time, Farabee shouted, "Bomb away." The plane lurched upwards, suddenly 10,000 pounds lighter. Tibbets immediately threw the Enola Gay into the violent 155-degree diving turn he had practiced so many times. He and Lewis pushed the throttles to their maximum, urging every ounce of speed from the straining engines. The countdown had begun. Little Boy tumbled from the bomb bay, its sleek, dark green casing glinting in the sun. It fell for 43 seconds, a silent, streamlined messenger of death, descending toward a city that did not see it, did not hear it, did not know it was there. Down below, the world was made of individual moments. A child looking up at the sky, a woman hanging laundry, a man lighting a cigarette. All these tiny, ordinary moments were about to be extinguished by a single extraordinary one. Aboard the Enola Gay, the crew counted down. They had their goggles on, their faces turned away from the windows. They braced for the shockwave. The 43 seconds seemed like an eternity, and then it happened. Chapter 7. A Sun of Another Kind. In the 44th second, at an altitude of 1,900 feet, directly above the Shima Surgical Clinic, the internal mechanisms of Little Boy functioned perfectly. The barometric pressure switch triggered a radar altimeter, which in turn sent a signal to the firing unit. A conventional explosive charge fired a 6-inch uranium-235 projectile down a short gun barrel at a speed of 1,000 feet per second. It struck a stationary uranium-235 target. The two subcritical masses were joined, instantly forming a supercritical mass. In that moment, a runaway nuclear chain reaction began. The nuclei of uranium atoms split, releasing enormous amounts of energy and more neutrons, which in turn split more nuclei. In less than a millionth of a second, 64 kilograms of uranium underwent fission. But only about 7/10 of 1 gram, less than the weight of a paperclip, was converted directly into energy, according to Einstein's equation, E=mc². That tiny amount of matter was transformed into the energy equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. The first thing anyone on the ground knew was the light. It was not a light that could be described in ordinary terms. Survivors called it the pika, the flash. It was a silent, searing, bluish-white glare that seemed to consume the entire world. It was 1,000 times brighter than the sun. It was a light that had no source. It was simply everywhere, absolute and instantaneous. For those who were outdoors and looked toward it, their retinas were burned away, leaving them permanently blind. The light printed shadows onto stone. Where people or objects stood in its path, it bleached the surfaces behind them, leaving their outlines etched onto walls and steps as ghostly permanent silhouettes, the famous shadows of Hiroshima. Immediately following the light came the heat. A wave of thermal radiation, traveling at the speed of light, radiated outwards from a fireball that reached a temperature of several million degrees Celsius. At ground zero, The heat was estimated to be over 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a heat that vaporized human beings instantly, leaving nothing behind but a dark stain on the pavement. Within a half-mile radius, everything combustible, wood, paper, cloth, human flesh, ignited spontaneously. Roof tiles bubbled and melted. The skin of people was burned black, in patterns corresponding to the colors of their clothing. Dark colors absorbed the heat, burning the patterns into their flesh, while light colors reflected it, leaving the skin underneath raw but uncharred. 13-year-old Setsuko Thurlow was inside a wooden building about a mile from the epicenter. She remembered the flash. "I saw the bluish-white flash. I remember the sensation of floating in the air." She was knocked unconscious. When she awoke, she was in total darkness, pinned by the wreckage of the collapsed building. She could hear her classmates crying weakly, "Mother, help me. God, help me." Then a man's voice urged her to crawl toward a faint glimmer of light. She escaped, but most of the other girls in the room with her were burned to death. The third horseman of this nuclear apocalypse was the blast. The dawn, traveling slower than the light and heat, the shockwave moved outwards from the epicenter at supersonic speed. It was a physical wall of compressed air, a colossal hammer blow that flattened the city. Within a 2-mile radius, 60,000 of Hiroshima's 90,000 buildings were demolished or severely damaged. Wooden houses were smashed into kindling. Brick buildings were stripped to their steel skeletons. The force of the blast was immense. It picked up streetcars and threw them hundreds of feet. It ripped trees from the ground. It turned millions of shards of glass from shattered windows into deadly projectiles that shredded anyone in their path. For those who had survived the flash and the heat, the blast was a new terror. People were hurled through the air, crushed by falling buildings or impaled by flying debris. Aboard the Enola Gay, now more than 10 miles away, the crew had seen the flash, even through their dark goggles. Co-pilot Robert Lewis, staring at the roiling cloud, wrote in his log, "My God, what have we done?" 45 seconds after the flash, the first of 2 shockwaves struck the plane. The tail gunner, Bob Karen, described it as being like a giant hand slapping the aircraft. The B-29 bucked and shuddered violently. For a moment, the crew thought they were taking flak. Then they realized it was the echo of their own weapon, reaching out to touch them across the miles. Tibbets steadied the plane and circled back to get a view. What they saw below was beyond comprehension. Where a vibrant city had stood just moments before, there was now a roiling, terrifying mass of black smoke and purple-gray dust, shot through with tongues of red flame. A colossal column of smoke was rising, churning within itself, climbing tens of thousands of feet into the stratosphere. At its top, it spread out into a vast, ominous mushroom shape. It was a sight no human had ever witnessed before. Tibbet's voice came over the radio, a report to Tinian Command, his words struggling to capture the scene. "We have bombed Hiroshima. Results good." It was a masterpiece of military understatement. Down in the ruins, the world had become a living nightmare. The sky, once blue, was now dark as twilight, choked with smoke and dust. The air was filled with the sound of crackling flames and the cries of the wounded and dying. A great firestorm began to develop. The intense heat from the initial blast had ignited thousands of small fires from overturned charcoal braziers in kitchens and ruptured gas lines. These fires began to merge, creating a single, massive conflagration. The inferno created its own weather system. Air rushed in from the outskirts of the city to feed the flames, creating hurricane-force winds that fanned the fire and tore at the ruins. For those trapped in the wreckage, it was a death sentence. They were either crushed or burned alive. Those who could move began to stumble through the rubble, seeking safety, seeking water, seeking loved ones. They were a procession of the damned. Their clothes had been burned from their bodies. Their skin hung from them in ragged strips, like peeling wallpaper. Their faces were swollen and blackened, their hair scorched away. They held their arms out in front of them to prevent the raw, burned skin from touching their bodies, a posture that survivors would call the ghost parade. They were silent, or they moaned softly for water. The rivers that ran through Hiroshima, which had been a source of life and beauty, now became a place of death. Thousands, their bodies burning with an unquenchable thirst, staggered to the riverbanks and waded in, seeking relief. Many were too weak to stand against the current and were swept away. The rivers became choked with the dead and dying. Dr. Michiko Hachiya, who had survived the blast in his home, was badly injured. He managed to make his way to his hospital. What he found was chaos. The hospital was still standing, but was heavily damaged and overflowing with victims. He and his few remaining staff, themselves injured, did what they could, but they had no supplies, no medicine, no clean water. All they could offer was a place for people to lie down and die. As the afternoon wore on, a strange and terrifying rain began to fall on the city. It was black, greasy, and radioactive. The bomb's mushroom cloud had carried dust, ash, and radioactive fission products high into the atmosphere. This debris mixed with moisture and fell back to Earth as black rain, poisoning the ground and the people it touched. Thirsty survivors, unaware of the danger, opened their mouths to the sky to drink it. In a single moment, the city of Hiroshima had been erased. It had become a vast, smoldering graveyard, a hellscape populated by ghosts. The world that had existed at 8:14 a.m. was gone forever, replaced by a new and terrible reality. The power of the atom had been revealed, not as a light of progress, but as a sun of another kind, a sun that brought not life, but death. Chapter 8. The City of Ghosts. In the hours and days that followed the detonation, Hiroshima descended into a state of existence that defied the vocabulary of war. It was not a battlefield. It was a charnel house. It was not a ruined city. It was a vast, open-air crematorium. The initial blast had killed tens of thousands instantly, but for the tens of thousands who survived, a new and more insidious ordeal was just beginning. As the great firestorm raged through the afternoon of August 6th, it consumed what little oxygen was left in the city center, suffocating those who had sought refuge in cellars and shelters. The winds it generated were strong enough to uproot large trees, adding to the surreal horror of the landscape. The city, once a bustling metropolis, fell into a profound and eerie silence, broken only by the roar of the flames and the moans of the dying. For the survivors, the immediate aftermath was a desperate search for family. People stumbled through the still hot rubble, calling out names, their voices hoarse and weak. Fathers searched for their children. Children searched for their parents. But in the uniform devastation, landmarks were gone. Streets were unrecognizable. A person could be standing where their home once was, and not even know it. The search was often fruitless, ending in the discovery of a charred corpse, or worse, nothing at all. Akiko Takakura, the young bank clerk, survived the blast despite being less than 1,000 feet from the epicenter. She was sheltered by the reinforced concrete walls of the bank. When she emerged, she found a world of ghosts. The parade of ghosts, she later called it, people with their arms stretched out, their skin hanging from their hands and faces. They were all silent. That silence was the most terrifying thing. She and a colleague tried to escape the fires, making their way toward a bridge. They passed countless bodies and people begging for water. The pleas for water were universal. The intense heat and burn injuries created a desperate, agonizing thirst. But the water in the rivers was contaminated with debris and corpses. Many who drank from it would later sicken and die. By nightfall, the fires began to subside, leaving a landscape of glowing embers and skeletal ruins under a smoke-filled sky. There was no electricity, no running water, no medical aid. The city's infrastructure had been completely obliterated. Over 90% of Hiroshima's doctors and nurses had been killed or injured. Most of the hospitals had been destroyed. The few remaining medical personnel, like Dr. Hachiya, were overwhelmed. They had nothing to treat the horrific injuries they were seeing. They could not even offer comfort, as their supplies of morphine were gone. They could only bear witness to the suffering. In the days that followed, a new and mysterious illness began to appear among the survivors. Even those who had seemed uninjured, they would develop a high fever, feel weak and nauseous, and their hair would fall out in clumps. Purple spots, signs of subcutaneous hemorrhaging, would appear on their skin. Their gums would bleed, and they would vomit blood. Then, they would die. The doctors were baffled. They had never seen anything like it. They called it Burabura disease, the do-nothing sickness, because there was nothing they could do. This was the world's first encounter with acute radiation sickness. The atomic bomb was not just a bigger explosive, it was a poisoner. The gamma rays and neutrons released by the nuclear fission had invisibly penetrated the bodies of the survivors, destroying their bone marrow, their digestive tracts, and their immune systems. The black rain had deposited radioactive fallout, contaminating the environment and sickening those who drank the water or breathed the dust. The bomb continued to kill long after its light and sound had faded. The Japanese authorities in Tokyo were initially confused. Communications with Hiroshima had been severed instantly. The Tokyo radio control operator noticed that the Hiroshima station had gone off the air. He tried to re-establish contact, but the line was dead. Reports from railway stations just outside the city spoke of a terrible explosion and a huge cloud of smoke. The military high command was skeptical. They could not believe that a single bomb could wipe out an entire city. They dispatched a young officer to fly to Hiroshima and report back. As he circled the city, he could not believe his eyes. He saw below him a vast scorched plain, with only a few concrete shells of buildings still standing. He landed outside the city and reported back to Tokyo, "Hiroshima has been destroyed." The news from the outside world was slow to penetrate the city of ghosts. The survivors were isolated in their suffering, unaware of the nature of the weapon that had struck them, or the global context of their tragedy. They knew only the reality of the ruins around them, the stench of death and the sickness that was beginning to claim their friends and neighbors. In Washington, President Truman was at sea, returning from the Potsdam Conference aboard the cruiser USS Augusta. When he received the report of the successful bombing, he was jubilant. He announced the news to the sailors on board, his voice filled with triumph. "We have just dropped a bomb on Japan, which is more powerful than 20,000 tons of TNT, he declared. "It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe." A statement was released to the American public. It described Hiroshima as an important Japanese army base and framed the bombing as a necessary military act to shorten the war and save American lives. The statement also contained a chilling warning. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has not been seen on this earth. For the American people weary of war, the news was greeted with a mixture of relief and awe. The idea that a single bomb could end the war was a cause for celebration. Few could comprehend the human reality on the ground in Hiroshima. The newspapers were filled with headlines about the superbomb, the scientific marvel that had secured victory. But for the men who had built the bomb, the reaction was more muted, more somber. At Los Alamos, there were initial celebrations, but they quickly gave way to a sense of profound unease. Oppenheimer, seeing the grim faces of his colleagues, knew that the atomic age had begun not with hope, but with destruction. He would later recall a deep sense of foreboding, a feeling that they had become instruments of a power they could not fully control. Back in Hiroshima, the survivors clung to life with incredible resilience. They organized themselves, clearing rubble, cremating the dead, and caring for the injured as best they could. In the days and weeks that followed, aid began to trickle in from the outside. But the scale of the disaster was simply too vast. The dead were everywhere. For weeks, the city was engaged in the grim task of collecting and burning the thousands of corpses that lay in the ruins and floated in the rivers. The initial death toll was staggering. An estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people, nearly a third of the city's daytime population, were killed on August 6th. By the end of 1945, the death toll would rise to around 140,000 as the effects of burns, injuries, and radiation sickness claimed more lives. The city of Hiroshima was gone. In its place was a barren, radioactive wasteland populated by the dead and the dying. It was a monument to the destructive power of this new age. But in Tokyo, the military leadership still refused to yield. They acknowledged the new bomb was powerful, but some argued that America could not have many of them. They clung to the hope of a final, glorious battle on Japanese soil. The suffering of Hiroshima was not yet enough to break their will. The reign of ruin was not over. Another city was on the list. Another bomb was being prepared. Another crew was waiting for their orders. The worst was yet to come. Chapter 9. The Second Dawn and the Emperor's Voice. In the wake of Hiroshima, a stunned silence fell over the Japanese high command. They were struggling to comprehend the scale and nature of the destruction. Was it truly a single bomb? Was it an atomic device? A weapon they themselves had dabbled with, but failed to create. While they debated and dithered, the gears of the American war machine continued to turn with relentless efficiency. The second atomic weapon, the more complex plutonium implosion device codenamed Fat Man, was ready. The initial plan had been to drop the second bomb on August 11th, but a forecast of bad weather moved the schedule forward by 2 days. The primary target was the city of Kokura, home to one of Japan's largest army arsenals. The secondary target was Nagasaki, a major port city with significant shipbuilding and munitions industries. On the morning of August 9th, just 3 days after Hiroshima, a B-29 named Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, took off from Tinian carrying Fat Man. Their flight was plagued with problems. A fuel pump malfunction meant they could not access 600 gallons of fuel in a reserve tank, shortening their range and time over target. When they arrived over Kokura, they found the city obscured by thick smoke and haze, likely from a conventional bombing raid on a nearby city the previous day. They made 3 passes, searching for a break in the clouds, but the bombardier could not get a visual lock on the aiming point. With fuel running critically low and Japanese fighters beginning to rise to intercept them, Sweeney made a fateful decision. He abandoned Kokura and turned toward his secondary target. Nagasaki was also covered by clouds. As they began their bomb run, Sweeney knew he had only enough fuel for 1 pass. If they could not see the target, they would have to ditch the multi-billion-dollar bomb in the ocean and try to make it to Okinawa. At the very last second, a small gap opened in the clouds. The bombardier, Captain Kermit Behan, caught a glimpse of the city's industrial valley, slightly north of the intended aiming point. It was not a perfect shot, but it was their only chance. "I've got it. I've got it," he shouted. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man was released. 47 seconds later, it detonated over the Urakami Valley. The bomb was even more powerful than the one used on Hiroshima, with a yield of about 21 kilotons, but Nagasaki's hilly terrain confined the main force of the blast to the valley, shielding other parts of the city from the worst of the destruction. Nevertheless, the devastation was immense. The Urakami Cathedral, the largest Catholic church in East Asia, was destroyed. The Mitsubishi arms factories were obliterated. An estimated 40,000 people were killed instantly. The horror of Hiroshima was repeated, a second sun rising over a second doomed city. At the same moment that Nagasaki was being destroyed, another world-shattering event was unfolding thousands of miles to the north. At midnight on August 8th, the Soviet Union, honoring a secret agreement made with the Allies at the Yalta Conference, declared war on Japan. A massive, battle-hardened Soviet army, over 1 million strong, poured across the border into Japanese-occupied Manchuria, crushing the vaunted Kwantung Army. For some in the Japanese government, this was an even greater shock than the atomic bombs. Their last, desperate hope for a negotiated peace had been to use the neutral Soviets as intermediaries. That hope was now gone. Japan was now facing not only the overwhelming power of the United States, but also the might of the Soviet Red Army. They were trapped, with no allies, and no way out. The twin shocks of Nagasaki and the Soviet invasion finally broke the political paralysis in Tokyo. On the evening of August 9th, Emperor Hirohito convened a meeting of the Supreme War Council in an underground bunker beneath the Imperial Palace. The council was split down the middle. The military faction led by War Minister Anami still argued for continuing the fight. They insisted on 4 conditions for surrender: preservation of the imperial system, self-disarmament, responsibility for their own war crimes trials, and no foreign occupation. The peace faction, led by Prime Minister Suzuki and Foreign Minister Togo, argued that they had no choice but to accept the Potsdam Declaration, with the sole condition that the emperor's position be preserved. The debate raged for hours, a heated, emotional deadlock. Anami spoke passionately of national honor and the shame of surrender. "Would it not be wondrous for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower?" he asked. Finally, in the early hours of August 10th, in a move that was unprecedented in modern Japanese history, Prime Minister Suzuki turned to the emperor. He bowed and asked the silent, divine figure, who traditionally only ratified decisions, to make the decision himself. Hirohito, his voice soft but firm, spoke. "I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad," he said. "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer." He stated that Japan must accept the Allied terms. He spoke of the new and most cruel bomb and the impossibility of continuing the war. His words fell like a judgment from heaven. The military leaders were stunned into silence. The emperor had spoken. The decision was made. A message was sent to the Allies, accepting the Potsdam Declaration on the condition that it did not prejudice the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. This created a final moment of uncertainty in Washington. Some hardliners wanted to reject any conditions outright, but Truman and his Secretary of State, James Burns, crafted a clever reply. The Burns notes stated that from the moment of surrender, the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. It also said that the ultimate form of Japan's government would be decided by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. It was an ambiguous formula that allowed both sides to interpret it in their favor. The Americans could maintain that surrender was unconditional, while the Japanese could believe they had preserved the imperial throne. The note was sent to Tokyo. It triggered another round of furious debate. The military hardliners were outraged. They saw the phrase "subject to" as a betrayal, a humiliation. They argued for rejecting the note and fighting to the death. Young officers began plotting a coup d'état to seize the palace, isolate the emperor, and continue the war. The fate of millions once again hung in the balance. On August 14th, the emperor called his council together one last time. He listened to the arguments, and then reaffirmed his decision. The war must end. He announced that he would do something no emperor had ever done. He would speak directly to his people via a radio broadcast to announce the surrender. That evening, in a studio at the Imperial Household Ministry, a nervous Emperor Hirohito recorded his surrender speech onto a phonograph record. His voice was high-pitched, and he spoke in a formal, archaic court Japanese that many of his subjects would struggle to understand. He never used the word surrender. Instead, he spoke of accepting the terms of the Allied declaration and said the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He spoke again of the new and most cruel bomb which threatened the total extinction of human civilization. The recording was hidden, awaiting its broadcast the next day. During the night, the military coup attempt reached its climax. Rebel soldiers, led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, stormed the Imperial Palace, searching for the recording to destroy it. They killed the commander of the Imperial Guard and set fire to the Prime Minister's home, but they could not find the phonograph record, which had been smuggled out of the palace in a laundry basket. By morning, the coup had failed. At noon on August 15, 1945, for the first time in history, the people of Japan heard the voice of their emperor. They gathered around radios in homes, offices, and public squares. The sound quality was poor, but the message was clear. The war was over. The reaction was one of stunned disbelief, followed by profound grief and relief. People wept openly in the streets. For years they had been told to fight to the last man. Now their God had told them to lay down their arms. The divine voice had ended the divine wind. The long, terrible war was finally at an end. The atomic bombs had in the end served as the catalyst, the final undeniable proof to the emperor and the peace faction that continued resistance was futile. But it was the emperor's voice, not the bombs alone, that ultimately secured the surrender and prevented a final apocalyptic battle for Japan. Chapter 10. The Nuclear Shadow. The surrender of Japan on August 15, 1945, brought an end to the Second World War. Across the Allied world, there were scenes of jubilant celebration. In New York's Times Square, London's Piccadilly Circus, and cities across America, crowds poured into the streets, celebrating the hard-won peace. The boys were finally coming home, but this was a victory unlike any other in human history. It was a victory sealed by a weapon that had not just defeated an enemy, but had also introduced a new and permanent anxiety into the human condition. The world had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. The nuclear age had begun. In the weeks following the surrender, American forces began the occupation of Japan. What they found in Hiroshima and Nagasaki shocked even the most battle-hardened soldiers and journalists. The reporter John Hersey, writing for The New Yorker, was one of the first to tell the human story of the bombing. His groundbreaking 1946 article, simply titled Hiroshima, followed the experiences of 6 survivors. For the first time, an American audience was confronted not with the strategic calculus of the bomb, but with its horrifying human cost. The melting eyeballs, the skin that slipped off in gloves, the mysterious radiation sickness. Hersey's work was a sensation, forcing a public that had celebrated the bomb to grapple with its moral consequences. The survivors of the bombings, known in Japan as the hibakusha, or explosion-affected people, began a long and difficult journey. They faced not only the physical scars of their ordeal, the keloid burns, the chronic illnesses, the increased risk of cancer, but also deep psychological trauma and social discrimination. Many non-affected Japanese, fearing that radiation sickness was contagious or hereditary, shunned the hibakusha. They struggled to find work, to get married, to rebuild their lives in a society that often wished to forget the painful memory of the war and the defeat. But the hibakusha refused to be forgotten. They became a powerful moral voice in the post-war world, tireless advocates for peace and the abolition of nuclear weapons. Their motto became, "No more Hiroshimas." Their stories, preserved in testimony and memorials, served as a permanent harrowing reminder of the consequences of nuclear war. The cities themselves rose, phoenix-like, from the ashes. Hiroshima, in an extraordinary act of civic will, chose not to erase its past but to consecrate it. The city was rebuilt, but at its center, the one building that had survived near the Hippocenter, the skeletal ruin of the Industrial Promotion Hall, was preserved. It was renamed the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, or the Genbaku Dome. It stands today as a stark, silent witness, a universal symbol of both the destructive power of humanity and its capacity for resilience and hope. The men who made the decision and carried out the mission lived the rest of their lives under the shadow of what they had done. President Truman never publicly expressed regret for his decision. He maintained until his death that the bombings were necessary to end the war and save lives. "I never lost any sleep over my decision," he famously said. Yet, in private moments, he revealed a deeper unease, once confiding that he did not want to see another one of those things used as long as he was alive. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, became a tragic figure. Hailed as a hero after the war, he grew increasingly troubled by the nuclear arms race he had helped to unleash. He became a vocal advocate for international control of atomic energy and opposed the development of the even more powerful hydrogen bomb. For his stance, during the McCarthy era, his loyalty was questioned, his security clearance was revoked, and he was publicly humiliated. He spent his later years in a kind of intellectual exile, a prophet of the nuclear age who was punished for his own prophecies. Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay, also never expressed regret. He saw his mission as a duty performed, a job that ended the war. He lived a long life, but he could never escape being the man who dropped the bomb. He requested that upon his death, he be cremated and his ashes scattered, to prevent his grave from becoming a site of protest or pilgrimage. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ushered in the Cold War, a tense 50-year standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. The logic of the nuclear age was one of terror. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, kept the peace not through trust or diplomacy, but through the shared understanding that a nuclear war would mean the end of civilization. Humanity lived for decades under the constant threat of annihilation, a threat that peaked during crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the world came perilously close to the abyss. The legacy of Hiroshima is therefore complex and deeply paradoxical. The bomb that ended one world war began another, colder one. The weapon that was used to save lives by preventing an invasion created a world where billions of lives could be extinguished in minutes. It represents both the pinnacle of human ingenuity and the depths of its capacity for destruction. Today, Hiroshima is a vibrant modern city, but it is a city that lives with its memory. Every year on August 6th at 8:15 in the morning, the city falls silent, the streetcars stop, people bow their heads, and the peace bell is rung. It is a moment to remember the dead, to reflect on the past, and to renew the promise of peace. The story of Hiroshima is not just a story about a single day in 1945. It is a story about the moment our species acquired the power to destroy itself. It is a cautionary tale, written in ash and shadow, that reminds us of the terrible responsibility that comes with knowledge and the profound fragility of the world we all share. The mushroom cloud that rose over that city cast a shadow that reaches all the way to our present day, a permanent reminder that the choices we make, as nations and as individuals, have the power to shape not only our own destiny, but the very survival of life on Earth.